The clock face read 6:15, but the sky was still a bruised, pre-dawn blackness, colder than any man-made refrigeration unit could achieve. Lieutenant Harlan Vance gripped the yoke of the B-17G, the iron Duchess dash, his knuckles white against the aluminum. The noise, even before engines started, was a suffocating pressure. The shouts of ground crew, the distant rumble of trucks, and the terrifying, incessant wind whipping through the concrete dispersal area of RAF Nut Hampstead. But the real terror wasn't the noise. It was the silence between the engines. Vance looked out his side window, not at the ground, but up. He wasn't looking at stars, but at the running lights of hundreds, maybe thousands of other aircraft. Today, they were not just a squadron, not just a group, but a tidal wave, the largest aerial armada ever assembled by the 8th Air Force to date. A punch delivered deep into the throat of the Third Reich. Intelligence had briefed them with grim sobriety. The mission was paramount: surgical destruction of the primary Focke-Wulf assembly complex in central Germany, an artery-pumping lethal fighter aircraft into the Axis bloodstream. The cost would be historic. The numbers alone defied belief. Over 1,000 heavy bombers in the first wave, layered box upon box, protected by more long-range fighters than they had ever seen. The sheer scale meant the Luftwaffe, already desperate, would throw everything they had into the sky to meet them. It was a mobilization of machines and men that would transform the upper troposphere into a battlefield of unprecedented brutality, a theater wide enough to swallow whole squadrons without trace. Vance felt the familiar lead weight in his stomach, a mixture of fear and duty. He ran a hand over the cold leather of his seat. His navigator, Lieutenant Miller, leaned forward from the cockpit door. Target coordinates locked. Harlan. Weather looks clear over the target, unfortunately for us. We'll be seeing them all the way. Clear skies meant deadly precision for their bombs, but it also meant no cloud cover for escape, no hiding place from the inevitable onslaught. Below him, in the claustrophobic confines of the Sperry Ball turret, Sergeant Billy Bug Jensen adjusted his oxygen mask, the rubber cold and smelling faintly of disinfectant. Bug hated the turret, hated the feeling of being encased in a glass and metal coffin, dangling beneath the belly of the beast, separated from the crew by thin sheets of armor. But when the fighting started, Bug became something else entirely. Focused, precise, deadly. He checked the feed of his twin .50 caliber machine guns, the heavy, oil-slicked brass cartridges ready to spin into the breach. He was the anchor, the watchman beneath the fortress, the most exposed man in the formation, and he knew it. As the signal flare shot up, green and violent against the darkness, the massive Pratt & Whitney engines of the Iron Duchess caught, vibrating the entire airframe into a resonant, throbbing entity. One by one, then 10 by 10, and finally hundreds by hundreds, the airbase erupted in the roar of 4,000 horsepower engines, an industrial sound of war that promised devastation both to the enemy and to themselves. Vance pushed the throttles forward, easing the heavy bomber onto the taxiway, joining the impossibly long serpentine line of death waiting to take to the air. Today, the sky itself would be a war zone, and every man present knew they were flying into the day the world held its breath. The formation climb was agonizingly slow, a ballet of calculated, agonizing patience. Each B-17 had to maintain precise altitude and speed to keep the combat box tight, a cohesive unit of interlocking fields of fire that was their only true defense. If they straggled, they died alone. Hours passed in the thin air above the North Sea, the cold leaching the warmth from their bodies despite heated suits, the lack of activity making the nerves fray like old rope. They crossed the Dutch coast just after 10 a.m., and the change was instantaneous and brutal. Below them, the idyllic, geometric landscape of occupied Holland dissolved into a maze of concrete, gun emplacements, and the sudden, telltale puffs of dark smoke appearing far ahead. Flak, not the scattered, half-hearted stuff they sometimes encountered on peripheral raids, but a solid, rising wall of heavy German 88mm anti-aircraft fire, black blossoms of hate designed to shred aluminum and extinguish life. The B-17s flew into it like ships sailing into a storm, the metal skin groaning against the concussion waves. The sky around them became mottled and opaque, smelling faintly of sulfur and burnt gunpowder even hundreds of feet above the explosions. Vance had seen bad flak before, but this was unprecedented. It was concentrated, radar-guided, and aimed with lethal intent at the precise altitude of their formation. A B-17 2 boxes above and to their right, the Memphis Belle 2- took a direct hit squarely beneath the wing root. The wing snapped cleanly, instantly separating from the fuselage, trailing a long, hideous ribbon of fire and structural wreckage. The bomber inverted instantly, tumbling violently into the black air, its crew unable to bail out in time. Vance didn't flinch, but the image seared into his peripheral vision. A machine that had been carrying 10 men seconds before was now just twisted debris. "Bug, keep your eyes peeled. They're getting accurate," Vance barked over the intercom, his voice tight. "Roger, Skipper. Just metal up here, but they're climbing fast," Bug replied, his voice tinny but calm. Then came the first sickening metallic clang against the fuselage, shrapnel tearing into the iron Duchess dash. One piece struck the plexiglass of the nose compartment with the force of a hammer blow, cracking the glass but miraculously holding. The concussion from a nearby burst rocked the entire airframe, momentarily throwing Vance against his safety harness. The plane shuddered, settling back into its course a few seconds later, vibrating with a new, unwelcome rhythm. The worst part of the flak was the waiting. There was nothing to shoot back at, only the silent, invisible enemy on the ground aiming with inhuman precision. They just had to fly straight, maintain speed, and take the punishment until they were clear of the defensive batteries. They had to fly straight for the bombardier to get his run, and they had to fly straight because breaking formation meant instant isolation and certain death. It was a test of nerve, a passive, terrifying acceptance of fate that stretched every man's psychological limit. They knew that beyond this lethal curtain of steel, the real threat, the true enemy, was waiting. The eager young men of the Luftwaffe, fueled by desperation and defending their homeland with everything they had. The flak receded as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a sudden, ominous quiet, the kind of silence that screams danger. They had penetrated the coastal defenses, and now they were deep over hostile territory. And then the radios crackled to life, not with chatter, but with the urgent, terrified shouts of the lead element reporting contact. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high, coming in fast." The sky, which moments before had been filled only with American bombers, was now crawling with predators. The Luftwaffe, massed in incredible numbers, arrived not in tactical pairs, but in massive, sweeping staffels, formations of 20, 30, sometimes 50 fighters at a time. The air battle had begun in earnest, and it was immediately clear that the German High Command had dedicated every last operational aircraft to this intercept. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s flashed through the gaps in the formation, blurring past the windows. Bug's turret erupted in a continuous, deafening roar, the hot brass casings ejecting into the slipstream. 2 bandits down on the 6. Confirmed kill. 1 going down trailing smoke, Bug yelled, his youthful adrenaline overcoming his fear. The defensive fire from the hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns surrounding the Iron Duchess created a visible, glittering curtain of tracer fire, 1,000 points of light designed to deter and destroy. But the enemy pushed through, determined to break the cohesive strength of the bombing boxes. FW190, painted with garish yellow markings, came head-on toward the Iron Duchess's nose, its 4 cannons spitting fire. The nose gunner opened up, the tracer streaming directly into the cockpit of the fighter. For a sickening moment, it looked like a collision was inevitable, but the 190 exploded just short of the B-17, disintegrating into flaming shrapnel that slammed into the nose and right wing, punching 2 large holes through the stressed aluminum. Miller, the navigator, ducked, shouting, "Holes in the wing! Looks like fuel is holding, but we're taking hits." The pressure was unrelenting. It wasn't a single attack. It was a siege. The Luftwaffe pilots pressed their attacks to ridiculously close range, ignoring the heavy losses they were taking, flying straight into the deadly cone of fire. The air was thick with smoke, vaporized oil, spent cartridges, and the grotesque sight of falling bodies. Parachutes that failed to open, or pilots who didn't even get the chance to jump. The attrition rate was visible in real time. Vance saw the B-17 on his left bank suddenly drop its nose, losing power from 2 engines, becoming a crippled straggler instantly targeted by a pack of hungry Messerschmitts. The sight was a constant reminder of the razor-thin margin for error. Vance focused intensely on maintaining position, fighting the heavy, shuddering controls, knowing that any deviation would be fatal. Every man in the crew was firing, the rhythmic thudding of the machine guns providing a brutal, hypnotic soundtrack to the mayhem. The sky was turning red, not just from tracer fire, but from the fiery contrails of burning fuel and the reflection of dozens of shattered planes falling thousands of feet to the frozen earth below. The battle for air superiority was not a gentlemanly duel. It was a vicious, industrial meat grinder, and they were firmly stuck between the blades. Just as the conventional fighters began to retreat, either out of ammunition or overwhelmed by the collective firepower of the bombing formations, a new, far deadlier threat emerged, signifying a desperate escalation by the enemy. The sky was suddenly filled with monstrous twin-engine aircraft. The Me-110 and the massive Me-410, lumbering but heavily armed destroyers that the Germans used as anti-bomber platforms. These were not nimble dogfighters. They were flying gun carriages designed specifically to obliterate B-17s quickly and efficiently. Several of them approached from high altitude, maintaining a standoff distance, firing heavy 30mm cannons whose shells hit the bombers with the force of small artillery. The sound was terrifyingly different, a deeper, more concussive impact that ripped larger, jagged holes in the wings and fuselage. One Me-410 peeled away and attacked the box directly ahead of Vance, unleashing a salvo of powerful air-to-air rockets. The rocket trails were smoky white lines, impossibly fast. The lead rocket struck a B-17 named the Wanderer amidships. There was no fire, only instantaneous structural collapse. The entire midsection of the bomber simply ceased to exist, leaving only the cockpit section and the tail section tumbling separately, their momentum carrying them away from the formation in separate spirals of death. The sight was so absolute, so complete, that it momentarily stunned the gunners. "Bug, focus. Look out for the big boys. They're coming in high," Vance yelled, trying to pierce through the shock. The Iron Duchess took a heavy hit in the No. 2 engine nacelle. A plume of black smoke erupted instantly, followed by the shuddering grind of the engine seizing. The oil pressure plummeted. Vance frantically feathered the propeller, trying to stop the catastrophic windmilling, fighting the huge asymmetrical drag. "Engine 2 is gone. We're running on 3, but we're holding altitude. Navigator, give me a status check." Miller's report was grim. 2 tires shot out, a hole the size of a dinner plate in the rear fuselage, and the hydraulic lines to the tail surfaces were sluggish. They were hurt, bleeding altitude slowly, but still in formation, clinging desperately to the protection of the group. And then, far off to the eastern horizon, Vance saw it. A blur of speed unlike anything he had encountered before. It was fleeting, a silver dart that moved with uncanny silence and velocity, a shape that did not conform to the propeller-driven fighters they knew. It was a single Me-262 jet, a terrifying harbinger of German technological desperation, making a single, slashing pass high above the formation before disappearing back toward the interior. Though it hadn't attacked, its very presence was a psychological weapon. The knowledge that the enemy held weapons of future destruction that the Allies currently had no answer for. This momentary terror was replaced by immediate danger, however, as the heavy fighters closed in again. Vance knew if they lost one more engine, they would fall out of the box, and that was a death sentence. They were halfway to the target, alone, 3,000 miles from home, with the sky screaming the collective agony of 5,000 aircraft and the men who flew them, and the worst part of the day was still ahead. Just as the despair began to settle, the realization that they couldn't endure much more of this ceaseless pounding, a sudden, glorious shift occurred. The Luftwaffe fighters, which had been pressing their advantage with reckless abandon, suddenly broke off their attacks, scattering violently. The high canopy of the battle was transformed by the arrival of a salvation Vance had prayed for since crossing the coast. The Little Friends. Sleek, fast, and radiating pure, unadulterated menace, the P-51 Mustangs arrived. Not a handful, but scores of them, long-range escort fighters that had fought their way through the German defensive screen and now asserted American air dominance over the very heart of the Reich. Captain Jake Riley, piloting a P-51D named the Texas Toothpick Dash, saw the chaos below him. He was flying top cover at 30,000 feet, his eyes scanning the debris field. The sight of the shredded bomber formation was shocking. The air was visibly littered with aluminum confetti and oil slicks. He spotted the iron Duchess dash, recognizable by the black smoke feathering from the No. 2 engine, hanging on by sheer will. Riley banked hard, diving toward a group of Mi-109s attempting a coordinated attack on a crippled straggler. His 6.50 calibers hammered, the familiar sound a welcome symphony against the roar of his Packard Merlin engine. He opened fire on the closest 109 at nearly 400 yards. The enemy fighter exploded violently, the pieces raining down. Riley pulled a high G-turn, coming around on a second 109 that was weaving desperately for cover. His gun camera captured the moment the shells ripped through the cockpit canopy, instantly silencing the German pilot. The arrival of the Mustangs was like a cavalry charge in the middle of a medieval siege. The German morale instantly plummeted, their carefully planned, layered intercept strategy thrown into disarray by the speed and deadly efficiency of the P-51s. They were forced to fight on Allied terms, engaging in dogfights instead of simple bomber massacres. This was the turning point in the battle for the sky, the moment where American industry and engineering allowed Allied air power to truly dominate the European theater. But the victory came at an appalling cost. Looking down at the wreckage spiraling toward the earth, Jake Riley felt a profound, heavy weight. Every streak of black smoke represented 10 missing men, 10 empty chairs at the mess hall tonight. The mission was a success in terms of tactical penetration, but the human sacrifice felt limitless. The strategic calculus of air power demanded that they accept these losses to shorten the war, to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. But at what point did the sheer scale of the blood spilled overshadow the strategic necessity? When does necessary destruction become morally corrosive to the destroyers? I often wonder, looking back at the overwhelming violence of these battles, if the men on the ground truly understood the terrifying price paid for every ton of bombs delivered. If you were a pilot or crewman facing such horrific attrition, what decision would weigh heavier on your soul? The strategic necessity of pressing the attack, or the moral cost of watching your friends disappear into the void? Share your thoughts below, as the complexity of this conflict is something we must never stop wrestling with. The Mustangs carved a temporary path of safety, clearing the critical path ahead. Vance saw the silver planes flashing past, a welcome blur of speed and safety. They had reached the point of no return. The target lay just ahead. The temporary reprieve offered by the P-51s did exactly what it was meant to do: allow the lead bombardiers to find their coordinates and lock onto the target. The factory complex, sprawling and heavily camouflaged, lay just below the fractured cloud layer. The tension inside the Iron Duchess became almost unbearable, a physical presence tightening the throats of every crew member. This was the culmination of weeks of planning, 7 hours of grueling flight, and enduring the most sustained air assault in history. Now it was time for the payment. Flak returned with renewed ferocity, localized around the target area and thicker than ever, a desperate last stand by the ground defenses. But this time, the Flak wasn't concentrated on the altitude of the bombers. It was tracking their trajectory, trying to predict the precise moment of release. Vance had to keep the B-17 steady, fighting the crosswinds and the dragging weight of the dead engine, while simultaneously correcting for the shockwaves of the nearby explosions. The bombardier, Sergeant Henderson, lay prone in the nose, his eye glued to the Norden bomb site, that legendary piece of optical technology that promised precision bombing from high altitude. Bomb bay doors opening. Henderson's voice was crisp, cutting through the intercom static. The roar of the outside air rushed into the fuselage as the heavy doors swung down, exposing the lethal rack of 500-pound general-purpose bombs hanging silently, awaiting release. The plane lost lift momentarily, dipping slightly as the huge drag took hold. Henderson began his final corrections, his mantra soft and focused. On the Pipper holding steady, almost there. The entire world narrowed down to a single, critical moment, the release point. The vulnerability of the bomber at this stage was absolute. They were flying straight and level, sacrificing maneuverability for accuracy, a sitting target for any German battery that got a bead on them. Vance felt the rhythmic pulse of the explosions around them, each one seeming closer than the last. The co-pilot monitored the altitude. The engineer watched the remaining 2 operational engines like a hawk, ready to feather a failing prop at the first sign of trouble. The seconds stretched into geological time. Then, Henderson finally shouted, "Bombs away! Load clear!" A sudden, satisfying lurch of the aircraft signaled the immediate loss of several tons of payload. The B-17 rose perceptibly, lighter and more responsive, instantly giving Vance the ability to bank and dive away from the target area, breaking the deadly straight path. Below them, seconds after they turned, the factory complex vanished in a colossal eruption of smoke, fire, and secondary explosions as the main force delivered their payload with devastating accuracy. The shock wave of the concentrated ordnance reached them even at their altitude, buffeting the Iron Duchess like a small toy. They had struck the nerve center of the enemy's production. The mission, in terms of destruction, was a success, but the journey was far from over. The most dangerous phase, the long, desperate flight back home, was just beginning, and the Germans were waiting to pounce on the wounded. The retreat was an ordeal of desperate measures and mounting losses. The German interceptors, having quickly rearmed and refueled at forward airfields, reappeared with frightening speed. They knew the bombers were now lighter but also slower, battle-damaged, and running low on fuel. Furthermore, the German pilots were fueled by rage, having just witnessed the obliteration of one of their most vital industrial centers. This second wave of attacks was more disjointed but intensely personal, focusing on the stragglers and any B-17 showing visible signs of damage. For the Iron Duchess running hard on 3 engines, they were an attractive target. Vance kept the battered bomber tucked in tight to the remaining combat box, knowing that isolation meant quick execution. Bug, exhausted but running on sheer nervous energy, kept up a steady, calculated stream of fire from the ball turret. He had long passed the point of counting kills. He was simply reacting, protecting the fragile underbelly from the continuous stream of incoming attacks. He reported a Messerschmitt passing directly beneath him, so close he could see the grim expression on the pilot's face. He didn't fire. He conserved his dwindling ammunition, waiting for the attack run. It was at this critical moment, deep over central Germany and facing the onslaught, that Vance heard the dreaded call from the P-51 command on the fighter frequency, relayed by the radio operator. The escorts had hit their mandatory fuel turnaround point. The Mustangs were forced to leave. Jake Riley, having expended most of his ammunition and pushing his fuel gauge into the red zone, cursed internally. He knew the risk of staying too long, the necessity of making it back himself, but the sight of the limping bombers felt like a betrayal. He executed a final, sweeping attack, clearing the immediate airspace of a handful of harassing 109s, before climbing away and turning westward, leaving the slow, vulnerable fortresses to face the remaining distance alone. The separation was marked by a sudden, agonizing silence on the escort frequency, a silence the German pilots immediately exploited. The last 100 miles over German territory were fought with a grim determination bordering on suicidal. The Iron Duchess took another devastating hit, this time to the tail section. The tail gunner, Sergeant Harris, screamed once, cut off instantly. The communication line went dead, replaced by the sound of rushing wind and the alarm indicating serious structural failure. Vance knew Harris was likely dead or severely wounded, but he couldn't stop, couldn't divert. The mission was survival, and the only way to survive was to keep flying home. The brutality of the day had stripped away all notions of heroism and replaced them with a primal instinct. Make it to the channel, make it to the water, make it home. The sight of the Mustangs peeling off, their silver wings glinting in the pale afternoon light before they vanished westwards, was a dagger to the morale of the bomber crews. They felt naked, abandoned in a sky that now seemed overwhelmingly hostile. Jake Riley, meanwhile, faced his own desperate struggle. Having pushed his P-51 to the absolute limit of its operational range, he was flying a precision balancing act between speed and fuel conservation. He had sacrificed too much range helping the last few stragglers, and now he was running on fumes, alone, deep inside enemy territory, relying only on the superior speed of the Mustang to evade pursuit. The German radio chatter confirmed they knew the escorts were pulling out, and fighter patrols were scrambling to intercept the lone P-51s heading for the coast. Riley flew low, skipping the treetops when he could, using the terrain for cover, his senses hyper-alert. He had ammunition left, but he couldn't afford a lengthy dogfight. The extra weight and the momentary consumption of fuel during high-G maneuvers could be the difference between making it to the channel and planting his plane in a farmer's field. He narrowly dodged a pair of late-model Fw190s that shot past him in a blur, too fast and too focused on the larger bomber stream to spot his low-altitude flight path. His focus became a laser beam. Distance, altitude, fuel remaining. The sky above was still choked with the battle's residue, the smoke trails and contrails marking the violent path of the main engagement. But Riley was now in the lonely domain of the hunter trying to evade becoming the hunted. He felt a sharp pang of guilt for the bomber boys he had left behind, especially the ones he knew were badly damaged. That guilt was tempered only by the professional knowledge that if he crashed, he was useless to everyone. He had to save the machine, save the knowledge, and make it back to fly another day. His solo flight was a testament to the new reality of the war. The P-51 had given the 8th Air Force dominance, but it still operated at the absolute edge of its capability, demanding nearly superhuman performance from its pilots. Back in the Iron Duchess dash, the crew felt Riley's absence acutely. The attacks became bolder, the German pilots more confident now that the fast fighters were gone. Vance watched another B-17, smoking badly and unable to keep up, suddenly turned south, desperate to find a Swiss refuge. A choice of last resort, internment or capture, preferable only to certain death over Germany. The Iron Duchess was limping, slow, battered, but still flying straight, still holding the line. A true testament to the rugged design of the flying fortress, designed to absorb punishment no other plane could survive. The Iron Duchess was now a flying wreck, held together by sheer willpower and thousands of rivets. The cockpit was cold, the internal heater systems having been long disabled by shrapnel. Vance was fighting the controls constantly. The rudder cable tension was uneven due to the damage in the tail, making every small movement an exhausting battle against the heavy, asymmetrical drag. The silence from the tail turret was confirmed. The medic, Sergeant Thompson, crawled back and reported Harris, the gunner, was dead, killed instantly by a cannon shell. The radio operator and waist gunners were working to shore up a gaping hole in the fuselage with a salvaged piece of armor plate and their heavy flight jackets, trying to prevent further loss of critical air pressure and keep the deadly cold from incapacitating the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, blood, and burnt metal. Navigator Miller, despite a deep cut on his forearm, was the rock of the crew, calculating the precise heading needed to cross the English Channel at the narrowest point, constantly adjusting for their lower speed and altitude. He knew they were slowly descending, bleeding altitude inch by punishing inch. If they descended too far, they risked the concentrated light anti-aircraft fire over the port cities, the so-called curtain of steel defenses. If they maintained altitude too long, they risked running out of fuel before reaching the coast. It was a hellish calculation of risk versus distance, life versus death. Bug, finally retracting his turret after the last serious engagement over the Rhine, climbed back into the fuselage, his face etched with exhaustion and the grime of gunpowder. He was shivering violently, but alive. He helped the engineer check the damage to the wing spars, knowing that a critical fracture could mean catastrophic failure at any moment. This was the moment where the training kicked in, where the crew transformed from individual specialists into a single, functioning organism dedicated to self-preservation. Vance looked over at his co-pilot, who was staring out at the bruised, endless sky. "We're going to make it, son," Vance said, his voice raspy. He didn't know if he was trying to reassure the younger man or himself, but the words needed to be said. They were flying on the prayers and resilience of 10 men who had seen the absolute worst the war could throw at them and still found the strength to hold the yoke steady. The sky outside the cockpit was finally beginning to transition from the pale, high-altitude afternoon light to the hazy dusk of the coastline. The battle was fading behind them, leaving only the sound of the wind screaming through the shrapnel holes and the heavy, metallic heart of the 3 remaining engines beating out a rhythm of life against the silence of death. The sight of the channel, that gray, choppy expanse of water that signaled freedom, was still hours away, and the fear of ditching into the frigid waves remained a chilling possibility. The final approach to the English coast was the most tense period of the entire flight. They had survived the flak, survived the fighters, and survived the catastrophic damage, but they were not yet safe. The Iron Duchess had lost too much fuel and too much oil. The 3 remaining engines were overheating and sputtering erratically. The landing gear hydraulics were shot, meaning a manual, grueling effort would be required to crank down the landing struts, and there was no guarantee they would lock into place. Vance ordered the crew to jettison everything that wasn't bolted down. Empty oxygen bottles, spent shell casings, even personal gear, in a desperate attempt to shed weight and maintain altitude until they could reach their airbase. They crossed the choppy, gray expanse of the channel at dangerously low altitude, the water visible in menacing detail beneath their battered wings. The relief of seeing the familiar white cliffs of Dover was immense, but it was quickly superseded by the challenge of the landing itself. Vance radioed ahead, reporting their catastrophic damage and requesting priority landing and ground ambulances. The base commander, having witnessed the grim procession of shredded fortresses returning all afternoon, cleared the runway immediately. As they approached the familiar airbase, the full extent of the damage to the Iron Duchess became visible to the ground crew. The tail section was Swiss-cheesed, the leading edges of the wings were shredded, and the No. 2 propeller was frozen in a grotesque, fixed position. Vance flew a difficult, asymmetrical approach, fighting the tendency of the plane to yaw violently to the right due to the missing engine power. Every member of the crew was praying, the usual pre-landing chatter reduced to absolute, anxious silence. Vance nursed the heavy bomber down, using the remaining engine power carefully, touching down hard on the concrete runway. The 2 functional tires blew instantly upon impact, the shredded aluminum scraping a shower of sparks along the runway as the plane skidded violently to one side. But it held. The B-17 stayed on the runway, grinding to a shuddering, final halt hundreds of yards past the threshold. The silence after the engines were finally cut deafening and absolute. It was over. The ground crews raced toward the wreck, but the men of the Iron Duchess were already climbing out, stumbling onto solid ground, gulping down the relatively thick, warm air of England. The crew was covered in hydraulic fluid, oil, and the dust of pulverized aluminum, but they were alive, all but one. As Vance stood beside his shattered aircraft, staring at the visible damage, a testament to the brutality of the day they had just endured, he knew the cost. They had delivered their bombs, they had struck the enemy, and they had survived the day the sky turned blood red over Germany. But the rows of empty parking spots on the tarmac, the sound of ambulances, and the grim faces of the returning men told the final, silent story of the day. The establishment of air dominance had been paid for in the deepest currency of war, leaving scars that would never fully heal.